There was a time when family meant everything, when the bond between sisters was something no force on earth could break. But what happened on the set of Family Feud on a quiet Wednesday afternoon in October would stop Steve Harvey in his tracks, silence an entire studio audience, and remind every single person watching why love, real, unconditional love never truly dies. Two women stood on that stage, separated by just a few feet, but for 40 years, they had been separated by an entire world. And neither one of them knew that today, right here on national television, everything was about to change. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of episodes. He thought he had seen it all. He was wrong. Her name was Dorothy Mae Collins. She was 58 years old, a retired school librarian from Akron, Ohio. With Silver Streaked hair she kept pinned neatly behind her ears, and a warm smile that had reassured nervous children for over 3 decades, Dorothy had lived a quiet, steady life. A small house with a front porch garden, a church choir she sang in every Sunday, a husband Raymond, who had passed from cancer 7 years ago, a grown son, Marcus, who called her every evening without fail. By every measure, Dorothy Collins had built a full and beautiful life, but there was a space inside her that never filled. A quiet ache she carried, the way some people carry an old scar. You stop noticing it most days. But on certain mornings you wake up and feel it as sharp as the first day. That ache had a name, Sandra. Dorothy and Sandra had been born 18 months apart in Cleveland, Ohio, to a mother who loved them fiercely but struggled with her own demons. Their father had left when Dorothy was 4 and Sandra was barely 3. For years, the two girls were each other's whole world. They shared a room, a bed when it was cold, and every secret a childhood could hold. Dorothy remembered the way Sandra used to tuck her stuffed rabbit under Dorothy's arm every night, even though it was Sandra's rabbit, because Dorothy was afraid of the dark. Then came the summer Dorothy was 16. Their mother's health collapsed completely. Child services arrived. A social worker with a clipboard made a decision in under 10 minutes that would haunt both sisters. For the rest of their lives, Dorothy was placed with an aunt in Akron. Sandra was placed in a foster home in Detroit. They were told they would see each other again soon. Soon never came. Letters got lost. Phone numbers changed. The aunt who took Dorothy in meant well but discouraged contact, afraid it would upset Dorothy's adjustment. Sandra's foster placements moved 3 times in 2 years. By the time both girls were adults with enough freedom to search for each other, the trail had gone cold in the way only pre-internet separations can, completely, with no map back. Dorothy had spent real money, money she didn't always have, on search services over the decades. 3 different private investigators, DNA ancestry websites she had posted in online forums for separated siblings. Every lead came back empty or led to a wrong Sandra entirely. Her son Marcus had entered her into the Family Feud casting lottery as a birthday surprise. He figured it would be fun, a little adventure for his mom, something to get her out of the house and laughing. He had no idea what he was setting in motion. The Collins family, Dorothy, Marcus, and 3 cousins arrived at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta in high spirits. They had rehearsed answers at the kitchen table for weeks. Marcus had made a whole spreadsheet of common survey questions. The cousins had matching t-shirts printed. Dorothy wore a lavender blouse because Raymond always said it was her color. They were introduced to the competing family backstage, the Washington family from Detroit. 5 people, warm and funny, who immediately fell into easy conversation with the Collins team. Dorothy smiled and shook hands and answered questions about Akron, and something about the youngest Washington daughter's laugh made her pause. Something familiar she couldn't quite place. She let it go. She was nervous. Nerves play tricks. The game began with the energy that Family Feud always brings. Steve Harvey's effortless command of the room. The audience's enthusiastic responses. The friendly competitive banter between families. Dorothy was steady and warm at the podium. The Collins family held their own, winning the first 2 rounds and building a real lead. Then came the moment that started everything unraveling, in the best possible way. Steve, as he always does between rounds, turned his attention to the human side of the game. He walked toward the Washington family and stopped in front of their oldest member, a woman standing at the far end of the podium. She was 56 years old, wearing a navy dress with small pearl earrings. Her name, according to Steve's card, was Sandra Washington, née Harris. "Sandra, where are you from originally?" Steve asked, his tone casual and warm. "Detroit, but I was born in Cleveland," Sandra answered. Across the stage, Dorothy went very still. "Cleveland," Steve said. "What part?" Near the east side, I grew up mostly in foster care, though we moved around a lot. Dorothy's hand gripped the edge of her podium. Her son Marcus looked at her and saw the color drain from her face. You still have family in Cleveland? Steve continued. Sandra paused. A flicker of something old and unresolved moved across her face. I had a sister. I lost track of her a long time ago. Dorothy was her name. She gave a small, careful smile. I stopped letting myself think about it too much. After a while, hope gets heavy. The studio audience heard the name. A few people glanced toward the Collins podium. Marcus grabbed his mother's arm. Dorothy was trembling, both hands now pressed flat against the podium top as if she needed it to hold her upright. "Mom," Marcus whispered. "Mom, say something." But Dorothy couldn't speak. Not yet. Because she was doing what survivors do. She was checking, rechecking, making sure she wasn't about to make a terrible mistake in front of millions of people. She had been wrong before. She had been hopeful before, and had it cost her? She needed one more thing, one confirmation. Steve had turned back to his cards, preparing to move on, when Dorothy's voice came out quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried across that whole studio like a bell. "Did you have a stuffed rabbit?" The room went silent. Sandra turned slowly across the stage. She looked at Dorothy, really looked at her. For the first time, her lips parted. Her hand rose to cover her mouth. "His name was Button," Sandra whispered. "I gave him to my sister because she was afraid of the dark." What happened next has been watched over 200 million times on social media. But no clip, no matter how many times you replay it, fully captures what it felt like to be in that room. Dorothy walked around the podium. Sandra walked around hers. They met in the center of that stage, under the bright studio lights, in front of a live audience, with Steve Harvey standing 2 feet away, unable to speak. And they held each other. Way you only hold someone you thought you had lost forever. They didn't say anything for a long time. They just held on. Steve Harvey, the man who has made a career out of always having the perfect line, stood quietly with his microphone at his side and let the moment breathe. Tears were running down his face. He didn't wipe them. The audience, all of them on their feet, understood instinctively that this was not the moment for applause or noise. This was the moment for witness. Eventually, the sisters pulled back just far enough to look at each other's faces. Dorothy touched Sandra's cheek with her hand. Sandra laughed, that same laugh Dorothy had noticed backstage and couldn't identify. She recognized it now. It was their mother's laugh. It had survived everything. "I looked for you," Dorothy said. "I never stopped looking." "I know," Sandra said. "I know you did. I looked too." Steve Harvey finally stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was low and careful, the way a person speaks when they're handling something irreplaceable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the camera as much as the audience, "I have stood at this podium for a long time. I have laughed. I have cried. I have been surprised. But I have never, not once, seen anything like what just happened on this stage." He turned to the sisters, who were still holding hands. "Dorothy, Sandra, I need you to understand something. You came in here today as strangers on opposite teams, but there are no teams right now. There is no game right now. Right now, this show belongs to you." The producers had quietly halted taping. Nobody was watching the clock. Nobody was watching the schedule. Every single person in that building, crew, contestants, audience members, the camera operators had made an unspoken collective decision. "We are staying right here until this is done." Marcus had come around from the Collins podium and was standing next to his mother, crying openly. Sandra's foster daughter, the young woman whose laugh had first caught Dorothy's attention, had her arms around Sandra. From behind, both families had drifted together into a single group in the center of the stage, the competition entirely forgotten. Steve brought 2 chairs to the center of the stage, a detail the show's producers would later say was entirely his spontaneous decision, and sat down across from the 2 sisters. "Tell me," he said simply, "tell me everything." And they did. Dorothy talked about the aunt in Akron, and how she had written letters for years that came back unopened. She talked about the private investigators and the DNA tests, and the nights she would go through old photographs trying to imagine what her little sister looked like grown up. She talked about Raymond, her late husband, who had held her hand through every failed search and made her promise she wouldn't give up. Sandra talked about the foster homes, 3 families in 4 years, all decent people, none of them hers. She talked about aging out of the system at 18 with a garbage bag of belongings and a bus ticket to nowhere. In particular, she talked about the job at the auto parts warehouse, then the night school, Then the certificate in medical billing that changed everything. She talked about her husband, James, who had died of a stroke 5 years ago. She talked about the daughter she had adopted, the laughing young woman standing behind her, and how James had always said that family wasn't just the people you were born to, it was the people you chose. But I never stopped thinking about Dorothy, Sandra said. I always wondered if she was okay. I always wondered if she ever got warm enough at night after they took Button away. Dorothy laughed and cried at the same time. I kept thinking about that rabbit for 40 years. Steve shook his head slowly. You know what I think? I think Button did his job. I think he kept you connected all those years, even when everything else fell away. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the response was immediate and enormous. The clip of Dorothy asking about the stuffed rabbit and Sandra's whispered response went viral within hours. By the next morning, it had been seen by 40 million people. By the end of the week, 200 million. Media outlets from every country covered the story. The phrase "his name was Button" trended worldwide. But the real story was what happened after the cameras finally turned off that day in Atlanta. The producers of Family Feud quietly arranged for both families to stay in the same hotel that night. They had dinner together, all 10 of them. Two families who had arrived as strangers and competitors and sat down as something else entirely. Dorothy and Sandra stayed at the table long after everyone else had drifted away, talking through the decades, filling in the silences, grieving the time they had lost and also carefully, gratefully, beginning to celebrate the time they still had. Marcus would later say it was the first time in his life he fully understood why his mother sometimes looked sad in the middle of perfectly happy moments. She wasn't sad about what she had, he said in an interview. She was carrying a space that was always supposed to be filled. That night in Atlanta, I watched it fill. Steve Harvey, for his part, made two decisions before he left the studio that day. The first was personal. He called his own sister that evening, something he admitted on his radio show he hadn't done in far too long. The second was professional. He directed his team to redesign the show's pre-screening process to identify and reach out to families with separated relatives, creating what would become the Family Feud Reconnection Initiative, a quiet backstage program that has since helped reunite 11 families before their episodes taped. People ask me if it was staged, Steve said during a later interview. Every single time. I tell them I was standing right there. I watched two women who hadn't seen each other in 40 years find each other through a stuffed rabbit's name. Nobody writes that. Nobody could. In the months that followed, Dorothy and Sandra made up for lost time with a determination that moved everyone around them. Sandra drove from Detroit to Akron for Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving the sisters had shared since they were teenagers. Dorothy made the trip to Detroit for Christmas, sleeping in the guest room of the house Sandra had lived in for 22 years, in a neighborhood that was nothing like Akron but felt, she said, exactly like home. They went back to Cleveland together in the spring. It was the first time either of them had returned since childhood. They drove past the street where they had grown up. The house was still there, smaller than memory had made it, with different curtains in the windows and a basketball hoop in the driveway that hadn't been there before. They sat outside it for a long time without talking. Then Sandra reached over and took Dorothy's hand. She would be glad we found each other, Sandra said. She meant their mother. She would, Dorothy agreed. The viral moment had consequences beyond the personal. Organizations working with foster care families reached out to both sisters, asking if they would be willing to speak about their experience of sibling separation. A consequence of the foster, the care system that advocates have long called insufficiently addressed. Both women said yes. They began appearing at conferences together, telling their story with a clarity and a grace that came from 40 years of carrying it quietly. Dorothy's framing was always the same. We don't tell this story so people feel sorry for us. We tell it so that the next Dorothy and Sandra don't have to wait 40 years. Sandra's was simpler. Every child in foster care has a button somewhere, someone or something that connects them to who they were before. The system needs to protect that connection, not cut it. A year after the episode aired, Family Feud held a special anniversary segment. Steve Harvey walked onto the stage and told the audience he had a very particular guest update. The crowd, many of whom knew exactly what was coming, were already emotional before the first image appeared on the screen. The screen showed Dorothy and Sandra at a family barbecue in Sandra's backyard in Detroit. Their children were there. Sandra's adopted daughter, Marcus, and his wife, and their new baby, Dorothy's first grandchild. Born 4 months after the reunion, The baby's middle name was Sandra. Steve Harvey watched the footage with tears. He did. Don't try to hide. When it ended, he looked directly at the camera for a long moment before speaking. I have been asked what the greatest moment of my television career has been. I used to give different answers depending on the day. I don't anymore. He paused. It was a woman asking about a stuffed rabbit. There was a photograph now framed on Dorothy's mantelpiece in Akron, taken at that Detroit barbecue. In it, Dorothy and Sandra are standing side by side in Sandra's garden, laughing at something off camera. They are both in their late 50s. They both have their mother's laugh. Their arms are around each other with the ease of people who have always been this way, who were always meant to be standing exactly here. On the back of the photograph, in Dorothy's handwriting, are 4 words: "We found each other." People often ask Dorothy what she would say to someone who has been looking for a lost family member for years with no result. She thinks about it every time, even though she has been asked dozens of times. Her answer is always the same. Keep the details, the small things, the names, the habits, the things only the two of you would know, because those details are the key, and the door is still there even when you can't see it. Sandra's answer is always shorter. Don't let hope get too heavy to carry. Put it down sometimes if you need to, but don't let go of it. It knows the way home. The story of Dorothy Collins and Sandra Washington, 2 sisters from Cleveland who lost 40 years and found them again on a game show stage in Atlanta, has become one of the most shared pieces of television in the modern era. But ask either woman about the legacy of that day, and neither one will talk about view counts or viral clips or the advocacy work or the foundation or the policy conversations. They will tell you about Sunday phone calls, about driving 4 hours just because one of them had a hard week, about the baby with the middle name Sandra who already, at 8 months old, laughs like their mother, about the ordinary, irreplaceable weight of having your sister back in your life. That is the real legacy, not the moment on television, the 40 years that came after it.